There is a shaking in the earth. The winds of power are changing direction. And the watchmen of the West, those who long claimed the dominion of knowledge, of economics, of empire, are suddenly trembling. They are not trembling at bombs. They are not trembling at armies. They are trembling at India. Why? Because something ancient is awakening. For centuries, the West ruled the world, not only with weapons and wealth, but with a worldview. It declared itself the author of reason, the judge of civilization, the center of time itself. History was written from London, from Paris, from Washington, and now the script is being rewritten from Delhi. The powers of the West do not fear India's GDP, they fear India's identity. A civilization older than Rome, wiser than Greece, and more enduring than any European crown is rising without their permission. That is the panic. India does not follow their playbook. It does not bow to their ideologies. It is not ashamed of its past. It does not erase its gods or its scriptures to please a secular global order. And so the halls of Western power begin to whisper, what if we are no longer the center? What if truth is not our Western face? This is not just geopolitics. It is a prophetic moment. Every empire has its season. Babylon fell. Rome collapsed. The British Empire shriveled. Why? Because they turned from humility to hubris, from virtue to vice, from God to self. Now the West, drunk on its own philosophies, is staring into a mirror held up by the East, and the reflection is not flattering. India stands as that mirror, not perfect, not without flaw, but full of something the West forgot, a memory of the sacred. And this terrifies the secular mind, because if India rises, the monopoly of meaning is broken. If India thrives, the idea that only the West knows how to govern, how to live, how to rise is undone. But hear me, this is not a political speech. It is a spiritual reckoning. There is a realignment coming among the nations. Thrones will shake, maps will bleed, but through the noise, something greater is being written, a divine choreography. The rise of India is not just economics. It is the echo of an ancient calling being answered in a modern age. The West panics because it senses what it cannot control. And the question for all of us is this. In the days of shaking, will we cling to the crumbling towers of man, or will we turn our eyes to the ancient paths, where truth does not need to be invented, because it already is? Let the nations watch. Let the empires tremble. A new day is rising in the East. The world we once knew is fading. For centuries, the West stood as the unrivaled center of power, of progress, of prosperity. From the palaces of Europe to the high towers of America, a story was told that history was theirs to write and the future was theirs to shape. But now the script is shifting, the stage is tilting, and the empires that once reigned are beginning to feel the tremors beneath their feet. They sense a great reversal, a turning of tides. What was once above is now below, and what was below is rising. India's ascent is not just another chapter in economics. It is the signal of a prophetic inversion. India was seen through the lens of colonial disdain. It was called a land of mysticism, of poverty, of overpopulation, and chaos. The British Raj claimed to bring civilization to a backward people, never understanding that they were stepping into a civilization far older and more rooted than their own. But now, the narrative is cracking. The old powers watch as the ancient land they once ruled now becomes a force they cannot contain. India's rise is not simply about surpassing GDP targets or technological growth. It is about the reversal of an order the West believed eternal. This shift was foretold, not in newspapers or economic forecasts, but in the cycles that govern nations. Empires rise and empires fall, not because of the strength of their armies or the abundance of their gold, but because of their alignment with truth, with righteousness, with humility. The West, once aligned with a moral compass rooted in divine order, turned its back on its foundations. It exalted man over God, pleasure over principle, and convenience over covenant. As it did, the cracks began to show. The very foundation upon which its might was built began to erode. And now, as that house weakens, it sees another rising, a house it once ignored. India represents the return of ancient wisdom, not just as a memory, but as a force. The West built its might on the Enlightenment, on a philosophy that divorced spirit from matter, heaven from earth, faith from reason. But India never made that divorce. Even in the face of colonization, it preserved the sacred as central. It never ceased to see the divine in the daily, the eternal in the present. And now, as the West drowns in confusion, India rises with clarity. This reversal shakes the very psychology of the Western mind. It is not merely a strategic concern, it is existential. How can the East rise when it does not mirror the West? How can India lead without becoming Western? The panic is not about competition. It is about contradiction. India rises because it is different, not despite it. That is the threat. That is the reversal. The reversal also comes with memory. The West fears the reminder of what it once was. In the mirror of India's rise, the West sees its own fall, not a fall in numbers, but a fall in essence. Once the West carried the torch of civilization with a sense of mission, a belief in purpose higher than profit. Now it is a hollow shell, technologically advanced, but spiritually bankrupt. India's rise is a silent rebuke. It reminds the world that progress without principle is a facade. There is also a prophetic symmetry at play. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. India, once bowed under the boot of empire, now rises with a quiet authority. It does not need to conquer to be recognized. Its power is not brash, it is enduring. The West panics because it senses this shift is irreversible. It knows that the 21st century will not be a continuation of its own story, but the beginning of another. The rules it wrote are being rewritten not with anger, but with inevitability. This reversal is not a matter of pride for India alone, nor shame for the West alone. It is a warning to all who believe that dominance is destiny. For too long, the West believed it would reign at the top because it always had. It mistook momentum for morality, power for permanence. Now it must face the truth that all kingdoms built on sand eventually collapse. And as it feels the ground shake, it looks east, not to teach, but to learn. India's rise is not accidental. It is appointed. The ancient patterns are returning. The empires of today are not the eternal empires. The stone that the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone. The world is entering a divine recalibration, and the panic of the West is the sound of empires waking up to the fact that history is no longer theirs to control. The West rose through vision and virtue, but abandoned both. India rises with memory and mission. That is why the world is shifting. That is why the reversal cannot be stopped. The shaking will continue. Thrones will be emptied. Towers will fall. But what is rising is older than empire and stronger than politics. It is a return, not a revolution. And it has only just begun. India's rise is not merely one of numbers and technologies. It is a rise of soul, of heritage, of spiritual memory. And this is what causes unease in the secular palaces of the West, because this is not just about economics or industry. It is about identity. While the West drifts in moral confusion and cultural fragmentation, India steps into the light, carrying something the modern world has nearly forgotten, a sense of the sacred. And in that sacred, there is power, not the power of missiles and markets, but the power of meaning. The West sees a nation ascending not with shame for its ancient roots, but with pride in them. And that to the secular mind is intolerable. For years, the West projected its crises onto others. It saw in the developing world only what it chose to see: chaos, poverty, disarray. It never considered that its own towers were built on borrowed time. But now, as India rises, it brings with it a civilization that never forgot its gods, never severed its connection to the eternal. It still honors family, discipline, prayer, tradition. It has not redefined man, woman, child. It has not rewritten the meaning of life or tried to erase its own history. It has not bowed to every new trend, but has held the line. And this to the West is a mirror it cannot bear to face. India's rise reveals the West's descent, not a fall of might, but a fall of meaning. In the temples, the chants still rise. In the homes, generations still sit together. In the streets, festivals are not spectacles for tourists, but expressions of faith. And while the Western world lights up its monuments to celebrate confusion, India lights lamps to honor wisdom. This is not a coincidence. This is a confrontation. The panic is not about India's development. It is about India's definition of life. And the panic grows because it comes without apology. The West assumed that with modernization came secularization, that with development came moral detachment. But India has broken the pattern. It has embraced progress without abandoning prayer. It has advanced in medicine, engineering, and innovation without tearing down its spiritual altars. The West told the world that to be modern is to be post-truth, post-gender, post-God. But India has said no and still risen. That is the challenge. That is the shock. That is the reason why the West panics. It no longer holds the monopoly on the future. India does not seek to become Western. It does not see its past as something to escape. It sees it as a foundation to build upon. This frightens those who built their empires by erasing the past. The Western world once came to India to rule it. Now it watches India rise with a depth and identity that the West itself has lost. The cultural missionaries who once brought their gospel of progress now watch as their own societies descend into chaos, while the nation they once pitied now carries a vision they cannot replicate. India's moral compass is not perfect, but it is still oriented. It has not spun in every direction. In the courts of Western opinion, every tradition must be tried. Every value must be deconstructed. But in India, there are still things held sacred, still lines not crossed. The soul of a nation cannot rise without roots, and India's roots run deep. Ganges still flows, not just with water, but with memory. The hymns still echo, not just in temples, but in hearts. The family still matters. The elders are still honored. And while these may seem like simple things, they are the pillars of enduring civilizations. The West discarded its moral framework for the sake of freedom and found itself enslaved to confusion. It abandoned discipline for indulgence and called it liberation. But India did not follow. It has walked its own path, and that path is now rising. West built castles in the sky, but India built upon stone. And now when the winds blow, the difference is clear. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and a house that remembers who it is will not fall. India confronts the West with questions it cannot answer. What does it mean to be a nation? What does it mean to honor one's ancestors? What does it mean to believe in something higher than the self? These are the questions the West once asked and then abandoned. But India still asks. And that is why its rise is not just geopolitical, it's prophetic. It is not just a shift in influence. It is a confrontation of philosophies. One rooted in permanence, the other in experimentation. One looking backward to understand the future, the other burning the past to light the present. The Western mind believed that spirituality would fade as science advanced. That religion would die out in the age of reason. But India shows another path. It shows that a nation can split the atom and still chant ancient mantras. It can launch satellites into space and still touch the feet of a teacher. It can build digital empires and still fast during festivals. This fusion is not a contradiction. It is a revelation. The sacred and the scientific are not enemies. And the West panics because it has spent decades dividing what India has integrated. India's rise forces the West to face the consequences of its choices. It reminds the world that the loss of tradition is not progress, it is amnesia. That without moral clarity, freedom becomes bondage. That without reverence, reason becomes arrogance. The West watches a rising power that does not echo its voice and realizes that its voice is no longer the only one in the room. That is what causes the unease. That is what feeds the panic. This is not about East versus West, but truth versus confusion, identity versus fragmentation, memory versus forgetting. India's rise is not fueled by conquest, but by continuity. And that is something the West does not understand because it has severed its own line of memory. It replaced its prophets with pundits, its saints with celebrities, its scriptures with slogans. And now it sees a nation thriving without making those same trades. That is not only unexpected, it is threatening. As the West watches India ascend, it must confront the reality that material prosperity does not guarantee spiritual health. That technology cannot replace tradition. That power without principle collapses. India has not been perfect, but it has not forgotten who it is. And that is why its rise is more than political. It is moral. It is civilizational. It is spiritual. It is a call back to something the world has lost. And that call is growing louder. The panic is real because the mirror is clear. And what it reflects is not just India's ascent, but the West's absence from the very truths it once held dear. The rise of India has sent ripples across the global stage, not only because of its economic strength or population, but because it represents a future that does not conform to the Western blueprint. For centuries, the West has positioned itself as the architect of modernity, the guardian of enlightenment, the final word on what it means to be civilized. It set the terms. It defined progress. It dictated morality, culture, education, governance, and even faith. And now a force is emerging that does not need those definitions. India is not waiting for the West's approval. It is moving forward on its own terms. This is not just a geopolitical shift. It is a civilizational challenge. The panic comes not from the presence of India's power, but from the implications of that power existing outside the ideological walls the West built. The West fears what it cannot control, and it cannot control India's narrative. India is rising without shedding its skin. It is not becoming another version of the West. It is not adopting the Western secular model wholesale. It is not following every social trend or ideological pattern coming out of Europe or America. It is choosing a different path. One where tradition is not seen as a chain, but a compass. One where religion is not sidelined, but integrated. One where national identity is not a relic, but a source of strength. That is what unsettles the Western mind, because it shatters the illusion that there is only one way to rise. For decades, the West exported not only goods, but values. It taught the world that development meant Westernization, that to modernize was to become more like them. This frightens the West because it reminds them of what they lost. The panic is not just fear of the other, but mourning of the self. The Western project was built on certainty that it knew best, that it had arrived, that it had the final answers. But now, the questions are returning. And India's rise is one of those questions. It is the question mark that refuses to become a period. It is the interruption to the monologue of Western supremacy. And in that interruption, the world is starting to listen, not to a new empire, but to an old voice made new again. India does not need to dominate to influence. Its strength lies in presence. Its culture does not invade. It invites. Its philosophy does not command. It reveals. And in a world weary of noise, that quiet strength speaks volumes. The panic of the West is the realization that the future may be shaped by those who never sought to shape it, but simply to live it honestly and rooted. The age of one worldview is ending. It is becoming plural. And India is the herald of that age. That is why the West is panicking, because the story is changing, and they are no longer the only authors. There is a reason the West grows increasingly anxious as it watches India ascend the global stage. Beneath the charts and graphs, behind the diplomacy and trade deals, there is a deeper realization dawning. India is not just rising in power, it is rising in influence. And influence is not dictated by weapons or wealth alone, but by the ability to shape the desires, imaginations, and identities of other nations. For centuries, the West held the power to define what was valuable. It told the world what to wear, what to learn, what to believe, what to aspire to. It sculpted global culture in its own image. But now, India steps into that arena not as a follower, but as a creator. And that shift in cultural gravity is causing tremors the West did not anticipate. India's influence is not aggressive. It flows subtly through its cinema, its music, its cuisine, its philosophy, its technology, its spiritual teachings. It is not imposed. It is embraced. It is not commanded. It is admired. Bollywood now speaks to audiences the West cannot reach. Yoga has entered every corner of the Western world, not as a novelty, but as a necessity. Indian festivals are now global celebrations. Indian thinkers are shaping conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and digital spaces. And all of this has happened without a single military campaign, without colonization, without domination. That is the power of soft influence. And that is what the West cannot replicate. The Western model of influence has long depended on projection, on broadcasting its ideals through media monopolies, through Hollywood, through fashion, through its universities and newsrooms. It shaped the narrative of modernity by exporting an image of success, sophistication, and progress tied to its own values. But now, that image is cracking. It no longer holds the monopoly on aspiration. People are beginning to ask whether the Western lifestyle, stripped of deeper meaning, truly offers fulfillment. As mental health crises rise, as family structures collapse, as identity becomes more fractured, the glossy surface of Western modernity looks increasingly hollow. And into that void steps a different kind of example. India represents a model where development does not mean disconnection from identity, where education is not divorced from heritage, where public life still makes space for the sacred. It does not apologize for its culture. It radiates it, and that radiance is drawing attention. In the global South, many nations look to India not as a mere ally, but as a symbol. It does not have all the answers, but it is still asking the right questions. It is not immune to challenges, but it is not confused about who it is, and that clarity is the source of its influence. In a fragmented world, coherence is power, and India has it. The West watches all this with a mix of awe and anxiety because it realizes it is witnessing not just a rising power, but a rising alternative. An alternative to the assumptions, the models, the narratives it once believed were universal. And in that realization lies the panic. Because once influence shifts, everything else eventually follows.